Hello everyone, it's Martin, aka Anders, and today I wanted to talk about First Strike, or I suppose more specifically, the North American metagame going into First Strike. This tournament is, by all expectations, going to be the most formative and important event in the North American Valorant ecosystem's development thus far, and so it's important to set expectations going into this event, taking a look at the map preferences and compositional preferences of the established teams so that we can set a baseline with which we can compare the tier 2 organizations that might bring in any sort of mix-ups into the way that the game is played on a region-wide basis. Let's hop right into it. To quickly set the stage, if you've been completely living under a rock and don't know what First Strike is, it's the next step in the Riot-endorsed formation of a Valorant competitive ecosystem. Every major region is hosting their own version of First Strike with minorly nuanced rule sets. In North America in particular, First Strike is going to be formatted through 2 major qualifiers and then moving on to the primary event itself, with the very, very noteworthy characteristic that there are no invites involved. Every team, from your Sentinels to your random pugs, have to play through the quals. And it's because of that characteristic that I think it's even more important now than ever to get a level set expectation of what the North American meta is and has been most recently, so that when we see these tier 2 and relatively unknown teams coming through, we can see how they warp perceptions or throw wrenches into the works of these more established tier 1 and dominant tier 2 organizations. Starting from the top, we can look at the North American map preference metagame, which is still fairly skewed towards Ascent. If you watched my recent video on the NSGX Renegades Invitational, these are fairly lined up, with the sole caveat being that there's a little bit of market share being taken from Haven and being allocated more towards Split and Bind, but other than that, Ascent is still at the top of the totem pole, closely followed by Haven, then Bind, then Split quite significantly behind. If we move over to map skews, things get a little topsy-turvy. You have pronounced defensive skews on both Bind and Split, which is something we've come to expect. However, when we pivot over to the other two, they're orders of magnitude off of the global norm. In Ascent's case, we're approaching a 50-50 split when we expect a rather significant defensive skew, and in Haven's case, where we've come to expect somewhere between a 50 and 52% offensive bias, this is now flipped to a 48-52 for the defense. This could be the result of sampling bias, but if you look at the scale of data that's being used for these specific numbers, it's a little bit of a hard sell. This is going to be based off of all of the numbers from the last 2 patches, so 1.09 and what I've been calling 1.095, patch 1.10, but excluding Icebox. And if we look at the specific numbers there, those 2 patches account for well north of 3,000 rounds of tournament play. I have what I believe to be a fairly well-reasoned take on why this is the way it is, at least in Haven's case, but we'll get down to that a little bit more later. Moving on to compositional and agent analysis, I think that looking at statistics on an agent-by-agent basis is actually going to be fairly useless here. I think an agent in isolation isn't going to communicate to a lot of actionable information. However, I think where we're going to be looking at coordinated teams moving into what should be the most serious event in North American Valorant's history thus far, looking at compositions is going to have a lot of value. Because of that, I'm going to go over the top 5 most prevalent compositions in North America overall, and then I'm going to be looking at compositions on a map-by-map basis, looking at isolated map-specific metas. Staying true to that, here's the top 5 most played compositions in the last 2 patches in North American Pro Play. As you can see, there's fairly marked concentration and drop-off here, with the top on the list boasting an almost full 5th of the North American metagame, whereas as soon as you get to even just the 5th, that portion drops down to not even 6%. On the topic of concentration, we can see here that there's a 3-agent core that is present through literally all of these top 5 compositions. You may have heard repeatedly in my recent videos that I'm a heavy critic of the meta concentration and lack of diversity in North America, and this is a perfect highlight of what that is. Again, we'll talk about this a bit more later, but it's worth pointing out right now. If we go through these compositions in order, at the top we have Cypher, Jet, Omen, Reyna, and Sova. This is a Reyna variant of a modern take on the classic dark web composition, where teams are now running Jet instead of the Sage that they used to, and are filling the 5th slot with a duelist of their choice. And that 4-piece core will be a recurring theme throughout many of these compositions. That quartet with Reyna, as I mentioned before, comes in at just under a fifth of the overall metagame with 19.7%. If we look at Haven, there's quite a significant amount more play, taking up almost a third of that map's metagame. And if we turn over to win rate, it's actually quite a bit less impressive, coming in at just 50.7%, showing up quite a bit better on Ascent though, with 53.25% there. Next on the list, we have that same 4-piece, this time with Breach, coming in at just 11.5%, so already a pretty significant drop. Not a substantially greater improvement on its most picked map of Haven, where it comes in at just around 14.5%, and its win rate comes in even below that first composition at 50.2%, with a win rate on Bind that actually comes through very impressively at 61.1%. This is something that we've seen repeatedly over time in Europe, where they lean very heavily onto Breach as well as Brimstone on this map and play very heavily into Retake. Breach's natural abilities to play U-Haul incredibly effectively and retake B through CT are always going to be highlights for this agent on this map, and so a higher win rate for a composition boasting him is not a particular shock. This third composition, we see the first one that isn't going to have that quartet, instead opting to run double flash-wielding duelists in Phoenix and Reyna and dropping the Jet. This one will come in at just about 8% pick rate, with its top pick map Haven not being dramatically better at 12.2%. However, when we look over at win rate, it's the best so far on the list at 51.4%, with its top map Ascent at 55.5%. Next on the list at 4, we have another situation where it's not that initial Cypher Jet Omen Sova core, instead we're running Reyna in the slot of the Jet here and bringing in Raze. Coming in at just around 6.5%, we've dropped way down the totem pole, and even on its most played map of Bind, it still barely breaks 16%. When we look over at win rate, it comes in at an abysmal 44.3%, and we see that on its top win map of Split, that does quite a significant amount better at 51.3%, but is still nothing to write home about if we compare it to the rest of the compositions on this top 5. In the final slot here, we have that base 4 of Cypher Jet Omen Sova, but this time bringing in Raze as the 5th. Clearly a fairly unique take on the composition. This is opting for no flashes outside of the Omen Paranoia, and thus is going to be running dry the majority of the time, relying more on information from things like recons, Aldrones, boombots, and Cypher util to allow themselves to push properly. For its pick rate, we have it coming in at just under 6%, not improving dramatically for its best map of Ascent at 9%. Its win rate, however, is quite impressive, topping this top 5 at 56%, with over 60 on Ascent. Obviously, being the least played out of this top 5, it's going to be more easy for those numbers to skew upwards or downwards, but nonetheless, incredibly impressive numbers for this composition, given that caveat that it doesn't have the entry utility that the others on this list do. As promised, we're going to move from here into map-specific compositions. I'm going to be looking at the top 3 for each map and explain a little bit on why I think that composition's dynamics are either well-fitted or poorly fitted to the maps that they're prevalently picked on. Starting off with Ascent, it's a lot of familiar faces. It's the most played composition in North America, the second most played composition in North America, and the 4th most played composition in North America. Ascent as a map plays fairly standardly. I don't think that the gimmicks on the map of the doors are particularly impactful in the ways that they warp map strategies, certainly not in the way that something like Split or Bind does. And so it's no surprise that the most played, most standard compositions in all of North America are also the ones that appear most frequently on this map. We see the near omnipotent but fairly well-reasoned core of Cypher as a Sentinel, Omen as a controller, and Sova as early intel as the bases of all of these teams. They then slot in a passive op option duelist in the form of Jet, and then they slot in an aggressive tempo-setting duelist as the final 5th. In the case of the first composition, where they're running Cypher Jet Omen Reyna Sova, we see a pick rate of 29% with a 53.3% win rate. Again, that's the top most played composition across all maps in North America. In the second slot, we see Breach Cypher Jet Omen Sova with a 14% pick and a really poor 45% win rate. This one I attribute to the fact that North America, especially on Ascent, does play very standard Valorant. In the realm of tempo setting, they lean very heavily on either passive ops or these 5th slot aggressive individualistic duelists. And of these three, Breach is very much so not that. He's not individualistic, he's very secondary in his tempo setting, and this composition is actually far more frequently seen in Southeast Asia, where Absolute Jupiter and Vision Strikers run it on the regular, where instead of relying on, say, a Reyna or a Raze as a forward tempo setter, they pair the Breach and the Jet and run set plays with both of those combined. In the final slot, we have the one that's the largest aberration as far as I'm concerned, with Cypher, Jet, Omen, Raze, Sova. This comp, at least insofar as it's played on Ascent, is kind of Team FYB's calling card, Team FYB being a fairly prominent member of the Tier 2 scene. That will bring us over to Bind, where we see a little bit more of a mix-up, albeit maybe not for the right reasons. We see the top most played composition for Bind is the 4th most played in North America, that Raze Reyna duo with the standard triple stack of Cypher, Omen, Sova. This composition I've been fairly outspokenly against in the past. The Raze Reyna duo setup is something that's really prevalent in Latin American and Brazilian Valorant, but is something that hadn't made a particularly large splash in North America until slightly more recently. And I'll be blunt, I don't think it's a particularly good idea. My general take on Reyna has been that her flashes aren't effective when utilized in a self-sufficient way. They're at their best when they're layered with a secondary flash and can't be immediately shot out, and that sort of dynamic doesn't exist in this composition. It feels like it's being pulled in multiple different directions and doesn't necessarily have a unified purpose. You have a lot of forward information grabbing utility in the form of the Boombot and the Sova util and the Cypher, but then you have an aggressive secondary segment of the composition that doesn't have the amount of impetus it needs to actually punch through any sort of passive offensive default or passive defense for that matter. With a 16.2% pick rate on the map and a win rate of only 47.1%, I think that a little bit of that is showing. I think that if this comp is going to succeed, it has to take a couple pages out of Anbox's playbook and rely very heavily on aggressive forward double blast packing if they want to get any sort of effective entry going. Next on the list, we have that standard quartet, this time paired with Phoenix. Something that's really interesting to me in the way that Bind is played is that you see these compositions with a standard floor and then a flash user in the 5th slot, generally speaking, and the most prevalent ones, at least when we look at a global basis, are going to consistently be Breach and Phoenix, and they both represent very polar sides of the flash user meta right now, at least until Sky is released into the game. On the one hand, you have Breach, who's very much so a flash-using primary type initiator, secondary type stally sentinel, whereas on the other side of the coin, you have Phoenix, who is pronouncedly primary type duelist and almost doesn't have a secondary archetype whatsoever. If you had to pigeonhole him, you'd be looking at either a very, very soft controller attribute because of his wall, or a near non-existent initiator subtype because his flashes are so short-lived. On the one hand, you have a composition that is looking to stall, usually going to put their Breach into U-Haul and play heavily for retake, and on the other hand, you have a team running Phoenix that's going to be entirely in their opponent's face, oftentimes using Phoenix ultis through teleporters to get cross-map information and play as forward as humanly possible. Two different styles, but when executed correctly, they both yield phenomenal results, the composition with Phoenix making up just under 15% of the North American metagame, with a 58% win rate, while Breach comes in at just under 12% pick, but a 61% win. That will bring us over to Haven, where yet again we see the top two compositions being the top two for all of North America and not just this map, that quad piece plus Reyna and the quad piece plus Breach. This is where I think it's going to make the most sense to start highlighting just how homogenous and untuned North American compositional strategy is. We've now looked at 3 maps, and in 2 of those maps, the 2 most played compositions were literally identical. One of Riot's hallmark decisions when it came to map design was that each map was going to have a distinctive quirk. There is no universe where 2 maps are so similar that there is a singular composition or a singular core composition that is optimized for both of them. That is not a state of being that does or will ever exist in this game. Instead, we have a situation where teams are playing a standard style and simply like to run it across all of the maps out of comfort instead of optimizing for the maps they're playing on. I bring this up now because we've now seen Breach, Cypher, Jet, Omen, Sova among the top 3 most played compositions on every single map. That does not make sense. And the win rates even reflect it. We know that Breach's characteristics are finally optimized for bind, so it has a phenomenal win rate there, but then we look at Ascent and it has a significantly sub 50 win rate. We look at it on Haven and it has a sub 50 win rate. It really is not rocket science to look at these numbers and just think about the game briefly to realize that there needs to be map specific tuning. But I digress, and I will say that the third composition on this list does show inklings of map specific tuning. As I was just mentioning, I don't think the Raze Reyna combo is particularly good. I don't think that there's really a cogent stream of thought where you can land that, yes, that's a phenomenal combo. However, when we look at Phoenix Reyna, I think the exact opposite. As I mentioned, Reyna's flash is at its best when it's layered with a secondary flasher, and when it is layered with a secondary flasher, it's some of the most potent, hard to work around entry utility in the game. On a map like Haven that's already fundamentally skewed towards the attacker side due to its 3-site nature, having such a potent entry utility stacked on your team is going to be incredibly valuable, and with a 12.2% pick rate and almost 52.5% win rate, this is going to indicate that that is very much so the case. It's not a coincidence that the only composition out of these three that isn't noteworthily highly picked on the other maps is also the highest success. It's the only one that took into consideration the map that it was being played on. And that brings us to the final map, which I think is the most interesting of these four to look at, because it's played so infrequently that when it is played, the teams that are on it are almost always going to have a specialized strategy. In this case in particular, we see the top comp, which is very much so the solo queue standard go-to for Split as a map, with Breach, Cypher, Jett, Omen, Raze. With just under 22% pick rate and 49.1% win rate, this is just what you would expect from a composition that largely represents teams' default when they're pushed onto a map they're uncomfortable on. Next up, we have a comp that is very much so not that case, and instead is one that has been considered a very split-tuned map since very early in beta, when people realized how incredibly powerful Viper walls can be when locking down the A site. Breach, Cypher, Omen, Raze, Viper boasted a 15.2% pick rate and a win rate north of 61%. This is going to be quite poignantly inflated by the fact that Andbox just bulldozed a couple of teams with this recently in the NSGX Renegades event, but nonetheless, a good composition is a good composition, and this sample size actually includes numerous teams outside of Andbox. It's a non-standard composition that has clear accommodation of map-specific elements and thus succeeds. Next up, we have Breach, Jett, Killjoy, Omen, Raze with just under 9% pick rate and an awful 43% win rate. I'm going to be very blunt and straightforward with this one. If you aren't picking Cypher on Split, you are literally trolling yourself. I don't care how cool or unique you think the certain Killjoy utility elements you found are, Cypher's ability to entirely lock down vents uncompromisingly and get cam value through all of A main or the majority of B site with vision obstructed camera angles is head and shoulders superior to Killjoy in functionally every setting. I'm not saying you can't play Killjoy on this map, but if you're running it as a Cypher replacement, you deserve a 43% win rate. And that will bring us to the last topic I wanted to cover, which is unfortunately, again, just how concentrated the North American meta is, and I also want to give you a funny little tool that is frankly disturbingly accurate in predicting which compositions will be played by any given team. We're going to start with the obvious, the Cypher, Omen, Sova core that has appeared in basically all of these compositions. The only reason it's basically and not literally is because most teams have been dodging Sova like the plague on Split. Starting with these three agents as our baseline, we already captured just shy of 2/3 of the entire North American ecosystem. Next up, we're going to add Jett to the mix, and Jett captures 62% of the compositions within that 2/3, bringing us to just over 1/3 of the overall North American metagame. From there, we're going to add in a duelist. And if in the process of adding in those duelists, we prioritize the two maps that they are most prevalent on, we end up capturing over 30% of every game that's been played in North America over the last two patches. I don't know about you, but at least in my perspective, this should not be a thing. Well, as unfortunate as that level of encapsulation is, that more or less sums up the North American metagame moving into First Strike. I'll be completely honest, that is incredibly bleak from my perspective. I think the state that we are in terms of Valorant metagame, is as close to as unhealthy as it could be at this point in time. We have gotten to a point where, at the highest levels of gameplay, people have created a Valorantified version of CSGO. We don't have a situation where teams are bringing in mismatches in utility. We don't have teams that are running triple flashes against a team that's running a Viper wall. We don't have matches where people are running triple controller against double flash Jet Reyna. We don't have any sort of mix. We have this homogenized steady state where a fifth of all matches are literal mirrors. If I wanted to watch two teams duke it out with identical utility, I would be watching CSGO right now. I would not be analyzing Valorant if that's what I wanted to see. And that's not to detract from CSGO. I understand that when you have two teams duking it out with identical utility, there's still so much strategic expression. You have rotational strategy, you have tempo and pacing, you have their ability to default effectively and how they hold angles, you have all of that mechanical expression. That's not what Valorant's about, in my opinion. Valorant is about creating these utility mismatches, creatively developing compositional strategy around different agents and their inherent synergies with each other, not just duking it out with one composition versus the other, where instead of it being CS where we all have smokes and flashes, we all have cloudbursts and omen smokes. We still have the same utility, it's just in a different form. We've CSGO-ified Valorant, and I don't think it's healthy for the game or at all what was intended for it. And I understand that, yes, this is only 66% of all matches played, but it shouldn't even be a quarter of them as far as I'm concerned, and it should be that way as more agents are added to the game. Nonetheless, even at this point in time, I think it should not be anywhere where it is, and the reason it is where it is because too many players are afraid to step out of their comfort zone. I hope that First Strike breaks this mold. Obviously, we have a lot of tier 2 teams coming into the mix, and I would love nothing more than to see them come in and catalyze an astronomical change in the way that the game is being approached, but I will be fully blunt, I do not expect that to happen whatsoever. But like I said, hopefully I'll be pleasantly surprised. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts down below. I don't know if this is a hot take. Maybe it is, hopefully it isn't, but I would not be surprised if I just pissed off half the Valorant community. So let me know your thoughts down below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on how you think the metagame is, how it should be, and where you think it might go. As always, if you're enjoying my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, you can find me elsewhere on the interwebs, on Twitter, where I frankly tweet out a ton, especially when there are high-profile events going on or new patch notes that are actually exciting. And other than that, as always, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.